Hi, I'm Austin Wintory, and slightly late, but here is a Q&A video based on some of the recent questions I got. I'll say up front, I apologize that the quality on this is pretty garbage. I'm recording from a undisclosed location. More on where I am and what I'm doing here later, but I'm just recording from a slightly damaged webcam on my laptop, and so apologies for that. I'll say also that as of when I'm recording this, the vinyl campaign for the Traveler Symphony album is about halfway done. I'm going to leave a link for that below. If you are interested in getting one of those vinyls, act on it fast, because we are going to press as many as there are pre-orders. So basically, if you don't get one now, there may not be another chance. So that said, there's already been way more orders than I ever expected, and I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for the incredible support. I've released a handful of videos about that project already, and I plan to release a few more, including about the orchestration process, the sort of raw videos where just show kind of fly on the wall of the behind the scenes process of the recording sessions and that sort of thing. But if there's anything else that you're specifically hoping to see or interested in, or especially for the composers who watch this, that something that might be particularly valuable to you, let me know. I'm happy to cater future content to those needs. That said, here, let's get into some questions. Okay, first question. This is a very nerdy one. What is your favorite Elmer Bernstein score? And you can't say To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay, well, that's wildly unfair, because I think my favorite score of his is To Kill a Mockingbird for two reasons. First, one was when I was a student at USC, one of my professors who I did private lessons with for at least a year was a woman named Erica Moll, and her father had been the head of the studio. I want to say Universal, although I can't remember, it's sacrilege, but the head of the studio, which had produced To Kill a Mockingbird, and she had a copy of handwritten manuscript of the opening title piano that was framed on her wall, and it always kind of overlooked us when we would do our composition lessons. And I always thought that was really special, because she was a very thoroughly concert music minded, so-called contemporary classical composer, but she had a great reverence for and appreciation for the world of film music, and so it was just a lovely bringing together of those things. The second thing was that a number of years ago, for a concert put on by my great friend Robert Townsend, I was commissioned to do a special flute and orchestra arrangement of material from the main title and elsewhere from To Kill a Mockingbird, and it was just so special to be a part of and to share the stage that night with an unbelievable lineup of composers. I mean, the number of people that Bob managed to show up for this concert was incredible. I mean, Hans Zimmer was there, John Powell was there, Danny Elfman was there, Don Davis, Cliff Eidelman, Brian Tyler, Michael Giacchino, Mark Isham. I'm forgetting. That's half the list. I mean, honestly, it was a huge. Look up photos of all of us standing on stage together. And my role in the concert had been to arrange the encore as a salute to Elmer Bernstein, and conducted this piece. It was truly an honor. So I can't lose that long-running affection. I've actually thrown a link below of a performance of that To Kill a Mockingbird medley that Sara did in Krakow a few years later. And she plays it amazingly. So if I can't say that one, I guess I'll go with The Man with the Golden Arm, because it is just raw, greasy gorgeousness, and I love it to death. Okay, next question. A lot of people who work in games do the music implementation in Wise or Fmod, the composer, the sound designer, or both. I really enjoy the process of making the implementation, but I don't know if I'll always have the opportunity to. That's a great question, and normally it's actually coming from the other way around. A lot of composers feel apprehensive at their lack of experience or understanding of how to use these middleware tools, like those two in particular. And so they're always trying to ask, how much of a responsibility is this of mine? And to that, I can only say that the more you know, the better. I have more experience in Wise, although I've been lucky that the last probably 20 projects of mine, I had a partner in crime that I got to work with who took it as their primary responsibility to be implementing the music in addition to whatever else they were doing. I've been functioning very effectively, I think, as a duo with folks, and not being extremely hands-on with that. But I have done it, and I will always be open to doing it more. And it really depends on the project and how the team is is set up. So if you like doing it, I think if you announce to the team that that's something you want to do, unless there's a very specific reason why they're set up that would be difficult, I can't imagine it's going to be a problem. And to any composers wondering how important that knowledge is to have, why limit yourself? That's always what I come back to. Probably said that on here repeatedly before, but it's just always valuable. My question is, you made an album of unused tracks a few years ago called Remnants. Would you ever consider doing a sequel if you have or write enough tracks? I want to hear more of your music. That's very kind. Yes, I did release an album called Remnants. I'll just go ahead and throw a link to that in the description below as well. The funny thing with that album was that was about an hour and a half of music, and I had shortened it from about, I think, 3.5 hours worth of material that it could have included. I could easily release another one, not to mention the fact that I've written a lot of music since that original release that has also gone unused or been rejected or whatever. So it's just part of the nature of the artist lifestyle, I think, to have a constantly growing garbage heap. So I've thought about releasing a second one as a follow-up. Furthermore, I've also worked on a lot of projects over the years, especially in the film side, where they were smaller projects, or even if they weren't small, they went totally unseen and unnoticed. And I never put out a soundtrack album. And I've thought about making a compilation of kind of like material that it wasn't rejected, it just kind of went unnoticed. Sort of like bottom drawer material or from the stock room, that kind of thing. So let me know if that would be of interest to you as well. I've just always had other things to do and I haven't made it a priority, but if that's something that could be interesting, let me know and maybe I'll slide it forward in my task list. Your scores and videos are always a thing that warms my heart. That's very kind. Is there any information on when we can expect your Aliens Fire Team Elite score to be released? Stay tuned. Sorry to be vague. I've gotten a lot of people asking about it, and it's genuinely very touching that people seem to care that much. It's not abandoned. There's very good reason why we've delayed, and that's all I can say for now. But stay tuned. What should a daily practice routine look like? What are the most important elements of composition to hone every day? I thought this was a really interesting question because I don't think anyone's ever quite asked me like that. You see a lot of great musicians on Instagram and YouTube and whatnot is putting their, like Hilary Hahn doing her, 100 days of practicing and those kinds of things. And there's no reason why there couldn't be a composer equivalent to that. One of the things that I always go out of my way on each project to ensure is that I've really learned something new. I try a technique, I try some kind of instrumental palette, or I try, I learn about a different or a new musical tradition, or usually it's some combo of all the above. But the idea is that every time I do anything, I should feel a certain sense of anxiety that I don't know what I'm doing because I'm pushing somewhere that I've never been before. That should be baked into every project. So that's one form of sort of daily practice, but especially if you're just starting out, I always just say the two most important things that you can be doing is to make sure that you write music every day. And maybe that's a lot of music, maybe that's a little bit of music, but I think if you're writing music every day, you are just bound to grow. Now, if you watch my video called Those First Steps, in which I speak to younger composers about the early days of their journey, a friend of mine, Chase Bethia, put forward an interesting kind of counter argument to that, saying that the pressure he was putting on himself to make sure he was being super productive every day was actually potentially stunting his growth, and that once he gave himself permission to kind of relax and not make it this daily grind, he actually perhaps grew more. So there's an interesting potential counter argument to the point I'm making, that mileage will vary either direction. Speaking for my own sake, especially when I was growing up, I wrote music every single day, and I learned a lot by doing so. I wrote a lot of really bad music. I think it's definitely important to give yourself permission to do that. The other thing that I would say, I said there were two things. The other one would be simply to do a lot of listening, to make sure that you never stop listening to music, and especially music that's outside of your comfort zone. Don't just revisit your favorite album or band or soundtrack or whatever you're into, but really, listen to things that are outside of your normal menu, and see if you can kind of, sonically unpack what makes them tick, whether you like it or not. To be frank, I think it's just a daily habit that is well worth a composer undertaking, especially a 21st century composer where there's no reason why we need to be limited by anything. A huge question I have is, what the heck do I do to get started? Not starting a song, but starting a career. As of right now, I write music purely because I love it, but I want to turn it into a career. How do I begin that? It may come as no surprise that that is basically an impossible question to properly give an answer to. But I think that there's two basic steps that no career can get started without, which is number one, the world needs to know that you're a composer and that you're open for business. So, interacting with people and making sure that, you've got a website or you've got a Twitter account or Instagram or whatever. Those sound like very obvious and basic suggestions, but unless you're putting out there some kind of intent, I don't know how you could realistically expect people to find you. So I think that's a really, really, really fundamentally basic thing that a lot of people don't even do, probably because it entails a certain amount of, initial vulnerability. You have to make yourself known and make the world aware of you, and that can be scary. So that would be step number one. And step number two is going out of your way to actually interact with the people who are looking for composers. So, in the case of video game industry, that entails going to, things like the Game Developers Conference, or going to Game SoundCon, or going, it doesn't seem like it really exists anymore, but E3 or other comparable events, or even, walking the show floor of a thing like PAX or even Comic-Con. And then there's innumerable online versions of these kinds of things in case travel is prohibitive. Even just literally interacting with people on Twitter. The number of times I've reached out to somebody where I just played their game and I wanted them to know I'm a fan, and then that led to conversations, is innumerable. So these two things that I'm saying are kind of interconnected. They're sort of the same thing in a way. Make the world aware of who you are and what you do. And of course, the second thing is go, if you're going fishing, go where fish swim. Make sure you're in the rooms with filmmakers or game developers or publishers, that kind of thing. And recognize that sometimes cultivating those relationships can take many, many, many years. And sometimes a friendship that just organically comes out of meeting someone at a bar, at a game developers conference party or something, may bear fruit 10 years later from a professional standpoint, and is merely a friendship for the first 10 years. And that has to be okay. It's very difficult to rush or force these things. I was very lucky in my career that stuff that we did as students working with that game company on Flow led to professional opportunities before we'd even graduated from university. But that's extremely rare. And in a way, I always feel a little bit gun shy sharing that story, because I don't want it to feel discouraging, like if something that stupidly lucky doesn't happen to you, that you should somehow give up trying. Because there's a lot of composers who I admire who it was, a decade or two after they finished that phase of their life, their student or coming of age days, whatever that may be defined as, before they really, found professional opportunities. I think that's normal. There is no real standard path, nor should there be. So this is well worth its own video, although I think some of this was definitely touched on in that video that I mentioned a minute ago called those first steps. And I highly recommend checking that out, because the four composers are all very talented, and they're all in the early days of their career, but they've all taken such proactive steps to building a career. And from my angle, they all look like people that are absolutely bound for bigger and better things in an all but guaranteed way. And their stories are worth analyzing and studying, I think. Moving on. I have one. If one were to record instruments that are not as common and can mostly be found in one place, should they go to that place and start looking for people there, or look for locals who might have them? The former will get more of a special vibe, but in the latter, the communication will probably be better, and one might achieve a more specific result. Hashtag Throat Singers Group 6-hour session for the Pathless. Plus, the actual ethnic music might be too weird for a Western audience, and yet the locals probably know the instruments best. I think what this question is sort of getting at is, if I want to feature instruments that are perhaps more esoteric to my native musical culture, like if I'm a composer living in the West, like in the US or in Europe, and I find, Eastern instruments or Eastern musicians that really spark my interest, or maybe folk traditions that are not part of the so-called classical tradition. Like, for example, there can be, like I did a game called Pode, which leaned heavily on Norwegian folk traditions. Well, that's still technically Western, but it's totally outside the orchestral canon. And then never mind the totally uncountably rich canon of material that you might find in Asia or in Africa, South America, all these sorts of places. So there's absolutely boundless treasure trove of musical traditions and ideas and performers who have spent their life, in some cases multi-generationally, mastering those. So the question is sort of just how to go about that, and it's something that's I've always been deeply passionate about. I've always loved the fact that music is so infinitely malleable, and there's so many different ways we can make it. And if you just take a random group of musicians from some random part of the world who make music, they're probably going to do it very differently than you, and they probably have different training, and they probably hear it differently, and they think of it differently. And I've always been what a friend of mine once referred to as a musical omnivore. My goal is always to try to learn as much as I can and find ways to kind of incorporate other people's ideas and sensibilities and fuse it with my own. Now, of course, it's always important to be doing things in a way that is done with a certain respect and a delicacy to make sure that it's not superficial. I highly recommend McLean Deemer's recent exploration of the traditional music of Korea, for example, as part of the latest Guild Wars 2 expansion, as a just absolute textbook example of how to merge one's personal sensibility with a musical culture outside of one's own, and done so with absolute reverence and respect and admiration and depth. And I couldn't be more impressed. He and I recorded a podcast that'll be coming out soon. And he also gave a talk at GDC about this very subject. And to the point of the question here, it entailed recording musicians in Korea and learning, quite a lot. I couldn't recommend that sort of approach more highly. This was exactly why, as per the question's hashtag, when I wanted to really feature the throat singing traditions and the instrumental, the folk, kind of like, almost like, this is a Western way of phrasing it, but you could almost think of it as like the farmland folk music traditions of Tuva, which is similar to that of Mongolia, but specifically the Tuvan throat singing tradition. It was something that became very interesting to me for the Pathless, and it was also very clear that I couldn't just listen to a random record or a couple of tracks I found on YouTube and then hire some throat singers and just tell them, okay, let's do it, or do the classic Hollywood trope, which I really have come to disdain, of putting some low pad down and then asking some so-called ethnic musician to improvise over it. I think that's all incredibly reductive. I think it's not only is it absolutely reducing an entire tradition to just something that's like decorative icing on a cake and with no real appreciation for all the nuances of that musical tradition, but it's actually holding back the creative potential of the music if you would just push a little harder. Another score that I hold in the absolute highest regard for avoiding all of that is Ludwig Göransson's Black Panther, in which he spent several months in Senegal basically just living and breathing these traditions as deeply as he could, and incorporating absolutely massive amounts of depth and detail into his work, and creating something that was a real fusion of his musical soul and Baba Maal and all the other musicians that he spent so much time with. I mean, you couldn't do a better job from a philosophical standpoint, in my estimation, than that. This is something really important to me. So if the question is, how do I go about doing that? Well, I think it's just very clear to have very specific and articulate goals about what you're hoping to achieve. One of the things that I definitely recommend against is incorporating novel elements just for the sake of them feeling novel. Like if you want to add something to an orchestra that sounds like an alien presence, I think you should be very cautious about drawing on cultural traditions as your way of doing that. There's a lot of not so pleasant implications about what I think is being said there, whether you intend it to or not. It's one of those where I think even if you're doing it with the most absolutely innocent of intentions, you do run a risk of creating a very wrong impression and shorting your own opportunity. And it could have easily been avoided. And like I said a minute ago, it's actually not the most creatively rich approach, in my opinion, at least, that you could be taking anyway. So food for thought there. I feel like I'm kind of making tangents around the actual question here. In my case, I've always made it a priority to seek out musicians that specialize in things that are different from me. And that can run the gamut. That can mean, if I really want a proper jazz piano solo that's deeply informed by the traditions of jazz, that's not really my tradition. I know a thing or two about jazz, but if I want someone who has it in their blood on a far deeper level than me, I'm going to go to a Mike Lang, or one of his colleagues, that kind of thing. And so it's not about just necessarily the dichotomy of Western and non-Western, but both Western and non-Western are umbrella terms that contain uncountable millions of musical traditions, all of which have people who specialize in them. And so I am always about going to the source and just learning and absorbing and recognizing that no matter how much time you spend with it, you're never going to be able to compete with the knowledge of someone who's spent their whole life doing it. And especially if the way they learned it was by getting it passed down to them by people who'd spent their whole life doing it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess humility is the fundamental takeaway there when it comes to trying to step outside whatever it is you think you naturally do, and looking for ways to blend it with others. I hope that's helpful. I feel like I kind of fired off on a handful of different things there, but hopefully it helps. The last question I want to answer is, was there ever a point in which you thought music just wasn't for you? And if so, what got you through the rough patches? This is a hugely important question and well worth highlighting. I have two basic thoughts. First, I've been lucky, very lucky, that I don't think I've personally ever felt that way. I don't ever think I've had a moment where I said, you know what? I don't think this career is for me. The days are too long. I don't like having my music that I've worked so hard on be told is terrible by a producer or whatever. I don't like the time crunch involved. I don't like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the stresses that are absolutely a part of this business. Sometimes, theoretically they could get to you and make you think, I don't know that I like the reality of this as much as I loved the dream of it. And now that I'm being confronted with the reality of it, I'm re-evaluating if I think this is for me. I don't think I've ever felt that way. I'll circle back to this in a minute, but I just wanted to say, first off, I feel very lucky that many times when I'm working really, really hard or things are really difficult, I step back and I say to myself, this is this job on its worst day. There's no time, there's no money, you're working for something. I remember I've had experiences where I was just absolutely killing myself on a film that I knew was terrible and that no one was ever going to see. And the director was an asshole and blah, 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 blah. And I remember thinking, it's hard. Like, I am working as a composer. I have a real gig. I am being paid to write music. If paid. That particular one I'm thinking of was not an exactly money job, but it doesn't matter. Point is, this was a professional situation. This was a real job. This was a real movie. It's something that is out there now. You can find it on Amazon or whatever. And yet it represented, in many cases, the worst version that this job can be. Like, it was just hell. And so it became a moment of, is this hell the kind that makes me think that the whole career is not worth it? In other words, on its worst days, is it still my dream job? And very lucky to say, in my case, it was a resolutely yes answer. Give me those tough days. Give me those crazy politics, or give me those incredible, budget challenges, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There have been times that were really exhausting or daunting or stressful, but they never made me stop to think, this isn't the dream that I thought it would be. It perhaps expanded my knowledge about what the reality can be, and maybe the dream is, needs to be understood more fully, but it never stopped being the dream. And I'm just crazy grateful for that. Looks like my laptop's fan is kicking into overdrive, and so hopefully it's not adding too much white noise to this recording for the last minute of this. The second point I wanted to highlight was that if you do find yourself feeling that way, that's okay. I have spoken to a lot of classes over the years of young composers, like at University of Southern California, where I went to school, or as part of workshops like the ASCAP Composers Workshop, that kind of thing. And one of the things I often will stress to them is, there's a certain sunk cost fallacy at play with young composers, where they think, okay, I gotten a degree, or I served as an assistant for years and years working for another composer, or some way or another, I've kind of started to pay my dues. And now that I'm stepping my feet out into the industry in earnest, I'm discovering I don't love it as much as I thought I would. And they're finding themselves with a kind of crisis of identity as a result, because they've just invested all this time and money with the belief that they would love it, and now they aren't. And it can be difficult to reconcile that. You think, well, am I a fool? How did I spend so much of my life dedicated to something that it turns out I don't particularly love, or I'm not as good at as I thought, or whatever? And I always try to speak to those kind of folks and say, if you find yourself out facing the realities of this job, and despite all the investment you've made up to that point, it's just not clicking for you, you need to know that's okay. Because first off, your talent and the skills that you have acquired need not go to waste. There are a lot of jobs out there to be filled by people that are not necessarily looking to be in the composer line of fire all the time, whether that's orchestrators or copyists or conductors or synth programmers or session musicians or recording engineers. There's a lot of peripheral tasks that, if you understand the work that a composer is doing, but you're just not interested in the full-scale aspects of it, there are opportunities for you. And I always like to just remind folks of that. It's not, you haven't lost, as it were, if you decide that those things are more appealing to you. In fact, the relationship that I have with Susie Sider, who's been my orchestrator for 10 years, was built on the fact that she had gone to school, studied composition, had all the training I had, but decided that's not for me. I don't really want to deal with that side of the business. And so she actively pursued being an orchestrator instead. And that was the premise of our meeting. And we've worked together under that banner ever since. And to me, one of the things that was so exciting about meeting her was that she had such self-assurance in this. She was confident that she didn't want to deal with that stuff. And I found that I found that self-confidence and sort of self-awareness very admirable. A lot of people, I think, convince themselves that they want a thing more than they actually want it, because they've more or less been told how cool it is, and they just kind of accept that. So I think part of this is just really asking yourself if it's a thing you really want, and recognizing that there's no shame in deciding, it's actually not as enjoyable as I thought it would be. I don't enjoy hustling for work, or I don't enjoy, the endless doubt that comes from being a freelancer, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever it is, it's okay. There's no shame in it. So I like to just remind that. And then the thing I said I wanted to circle back to is when I mentioned that I've been lucky, that I've never felt this way, that I've never felt sort of crushed and defeated. There is one sort of exception, which was maybe about 5-6 years ago. I was in a really, really dark place in my life, and I'm not going to drag through the details of it here, but I was definitely not okay. And I was experiencing a lot of very telltale signs of clinical depression. And the way it started to manifest, though, was that I started to find that I wasn't enjoying writing music. And at first I found myself saying, maybe I'm becoming one of those people that I talk about, that I just now spoke about. Maybe I'm realizing, maybe I don't love certain aspects of this job enough, and I should figure out another way to use my skills. I would have these late night, 2 a.m, lying in bed, unable to fall asleep, and asking myself these kinds of questions. Is this truly what I want? As it turned out in my case, I'm happy to say it wasn't that I had fallen out of love with it. It's that there was something else wrong, and it helped me. It was such a violation of my normal sense of identity that I was maybe not so sure I loved this. That I quickly thought, okay, I don't think it's that. I think it's that there's something else the matter here, and I should investigate. I should seek out, therapy or medications or just life, daily practices that might help stabilize where I'm at. And I'm happy to say that over time I was able to kind of recover and return to my optimistic self who bursts out of bed each morning really excited to get to work. But it took work to get back there. And so I just wanted to highlight that as a sort of 2.5 answer, that sometimes you discover you don't really love it, and that's okay. And there's other ways to earn a living doing it. Sometimes people don't ever have that problem. And then other times people fleetingly have that problem. And maybe it's a sign that there's something else going on, but that it really is still a job they feel deeply wired for. I think it's worth reminding yourself that any of these, or maybe something else I'm leaving out, are possible for you. There's no shame in that. There is no reason to think that you're doing any of this wrong. We're all learning as we go. We're all works in progress. We all make mistakes. We all learn a lot of lessons about both ourselves and about the dream, the job, the industry, music itself along the way. Part of why I like doing these videos and why I've kind of undertaken this whole YouTube channel in general is to have a conduit for communicating with people more openly. And I like these Q&A videos as a chance to get a sense of what's of interest and how can I be of help. It's not so much about self-promotion, my mentioning of the Traveler Symphony vinyls at the beginning of this video notwithstanding, as it is me trying to find ways to just hopefully give something that's useful to anybody who's watching, whether they be a composer or not. So as always, I really appreciate your engagement, leaving comments and questions, and obviously sharing these videos and all that kind of thing. If there's something in there that's useful to you. And as always, please leave comments below of further questions that this may prompt you to wonder about, and we'll just keep the conversation going. I really enjoy it, and I really hope it's helpful to you. It's actually helpful to me, so my thanks to all of you, because you force me to stop and ponder things that I may not necessarily have thought about in a long time or ever, and that's very valuable. So know that for all of you who leave questions, I'm very grateful to you. And with that, I hope this wasn't too long, and I look forward to explaining why I'm in a blurry room different from my normal studio. Take care, and catch you next time.